So we're going to be looking at Northern and Eastern Europe now in the late 17th to 18th century. Got your notes up here on my computer, so I can follow along with that. Since we're in Europe, I'm drinking a German beer because we're going to start out in Germany, and that's Beck's, so that's what we've got today. Looking at your notes, it starts with the Jesuits. Now, the Jesuits are a religious order, and they established schools. And around 1534, they began to teach people about religion in these schools that they established and how to live moralistic lives. And they started to realize that the best way to do it is through theater, much like medieval Europe did. So they really actually began to advance educational theater at this time. Now, it died out. The real educational theater that we know, that you spring from in these classes, was from 1903, George Pierce Baker, and we'll talk about that when we get into modern theater. But this is sort of the beginning, actually, real beginning of educational theater. And they didn't really have a whole lot of impact on professional theater, so that's kind of why it's not as big a deal in theater history. In 1551, we see the first production of a play in Jesuit schools. Within a few years thereafter, they're going to be in all the Jesuit schools all over. And they originally were plays that were written either by one of the priests, and then slowly other people started to get involved, and even parents would write plays for the kids. Initially, they were very, very pious plays that were done, but gradually they began to start throwing in comedies and music, ballet, and all sorts of involving everything that has been sort of popular. Of course, originally they were in Latin, and as they began to branch out into low comedies and things like that, they started using vernacular language. So this was sort of the beginning of how they started to do educational theater, sort of as we would see educational theater. But again, like I said, it died out by the 1700s. These schools started becoming suppressed. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So its impact, even on educational theater, sort of ceased. And we don't see educational theater again until, like I said, around 1903. Then the next thing you have in here is the 30 Years' War. Okay, so for those of you not terribly familiar with the 30 Years' War, it encompassed a majority of Europe. Italy and France, Spain, the Germanic states, all at war. Pretty much France was sort of dealing with Italy and Spain, the Catholic powers kind of encroaching upon them. Even though France was Catholic, it sort of fought on the Protestant side. And as they were kind of being squished between Italy and Spain, they kind of sought to branch out. Well, the only place to branch out is the Germanic states, so they started going and taking those over. As from the other side, other groups started taking over the Germanic states. So there was this big, huge scuffle for land and whatnot, and that's what the 30 Years' War was. Not that you really need to know that because that's just regular history, but what ends up happening from that is the fact that for 150 years, Germany is devastated, both via population as well as financially. So they really couldn't afford to do these lavish productions and things and so on and so forth until much later. They start getting into it to some degree in the mid to late 1700s, but it's going to take a long time before they can actually compete for being somewhat culturally powerful at all in the world. And they don't really even ever reach that point until early 1800s, and even then I wouldn't say it's culturally important in the world. So because of the takeover of a lot of Germanic states and actually France kind of making somewhat of an end to the 30 Years' War, Germanic countries their courts started to emulate French courts and import French and Italian plays, and so that's why we start seeing similar aspects of German court theater from French, because they start sort of copying the way they did. The next thing we're looking at here is before 1650 English touring troops. Okay, so basically German, especially northern Germany, the only real exposure to professional touring troupes they had was the English when they were coming over across the channel and performing in Germany because, until 1660, theater was dead in England. They had nowhere to go, nowhere to play, so they would come over and they'd play in Germany. And it became rather important to the German population. They were a novelty. They would occasionally actually, whenever they'd get into a town, they would pick a handful of German actors and say, okay, you're gonna be third spear here from the left, or maybe you'll get a couple lines. Or whatever. So slowly the German actors began to train a little bit with these English troops as they came across over and toured. So around that time, it was difficult for German touring companies to actually get any audiences because they weren't a novelty. They weren't as good as the English troops. So they had a difficult time really getting audiences until around 1660. And that is when the British troops pretty much left, or the English troops actually, pretty much left Germany because the Restoration happened and they could do theater in London again. After that, all that was left was the German troops. So those are going to start burgeoning after 1660. But I'm jumping ahead a little bit, so let me back it up here to 1652. On your sheet there, 1652, the Emperor of Austria imports Ludovico Bertoncini. If you remember him from your 17th to 18th century Italy and France, Ludovico and his father Giovanni Bertoncini, they were the ones who did that humongous production with 35 machines and people dancing in the land, sea, and sky. That was them. Well, Emperor of Austria imports Ludovico Bertoncini so that he can have lavish productions like that as well. Again, it's a big cultural thing. Who's more cultured, they're the more powerful. So that's what we see there. So let's go back now to 1660, where the English troops disappear from Germany. So again, like I said, the Restoration happened. They all fled out, go back home, start becoming more successful back where they were instead of touring through Germany. That leaves nothing but the German professional troops for the German populace. And they begin touring. They have to tour because they've got to keep getting audiences. Again, these people are still used to the English troops, and so the Germans just kind of don't quite do it for them, so they got to move from place to place to be somewhat of a novelty and get an audience. However, they're required by the state to give 1/4 of their receipts to charities like hospitals, things like that. We've talked about that before in the Renaissance. And because, just in order to remain successful, they had to change their repertoire. And so they had several different shows going on, and this is where repertory theater comes from, that concept of repertory theater, if you're familiar with that, wherein we're in a company and we travel around and we play, and we have 5 different shows that we have memorized and ready to go. So on Monday we'll be doing Othello, on Tuesday it'll be Hamlet, Wednesday it'll be Midsummer, and then we'll do Othello again on Thursday. That's a repertory. It's a series of shows that you've got prepped and ready to go. And that's what they had to do to maintain audiences. A certain clown figure sort of grew out of all this and figured prominently in all of their repertoire, and that was the clown named Hanswurst. Hanswurst was a sort of an amalgam of the Commedia dell'arte Harlequin, as well as English clowns from Shakespeare's plays, and the medieval clown or fool. Oddly enough, actually, the English touring companies coming over here, one of the reasons why Shakespeare became so popular in Germany, his plays, and it actually still is to this day. It gets revived again in the 1800s, and we'll talk about that later. All right. So in 1668, you have an elaborate court theater set up in Vienna. Okay, and that is a theater where they started importing a lot of famous artists and musicians, and so basically Vienna becomes a sort of the center for European opera from 1660 to 1740. Right? Because of that, other courts follow suit. They want to be as cool as Vienna, so they start following suit. So you get courts like Munich, Dresden, Gotha. They all create these opera troupes, right? And at that point in time, 17th century and Italianate scenery become very popular at the courts in the Germanic states, and as well as some of the commercial cities such as Hamburg and Leipzig, right? Which you see here next on here is Hamburg Opera Company. They created an opera company. Leipzig creates an opera company, 1693 to 1720. And they actually only performed kind of sporadically there, and also at this particular time, opera was sort of the king, and spoken drama was sort of rarely ever performed. All right. By 1706, you have 769 Jesuit schools across Europe, all doing basically what we consider educational theater, right? 1727, Gottsched meets the Neubers. Now, Johann Christoph Gottsched was considered to be actually one of the intellectual leaders of the Germanic states. And he settled in Leipzig, which is considered to be the intellectual capital of the Germanic states. And it was there that he met the Neubers. Now, Gottsched's concept was he wanted to raise the German language to some sort of a literary height, okay? And he didn't quite know how to do it. Then he meets these performers, these people who own a troupe, Caroline and Johann Neuber. And they have a troupe known as the Royal Polish and Electoral Saxon Court Comedians. And he starts working with them and saying, we can raise the level of theater, we can raise the professional level of theater in Germany and make German a language that can have a literary status. And so they start working on it. Now, they didn't last terribly long. Their association only lasted for about 12 years, but they set the foundations for what would then become the basis structure for every touring company, every regular repertory company, all right? And that's what we're looking at here, where you see 1740s regular drama in of all repertory German companies. This was laid out by the Neubers and Gottsched. So you have the Hauptaktion, which means chief play. This was usually a serious play or a tragedy of some sort. The Haupt- und Staatsaktion, which is translates to chief and state play. Same thing, sort of a tragedy of sorts, but also usually dealing with political or militaristic sort of a theme. And then you have the Dachspiel, which is sort of an afterpiece. It's literally how it translates to. And that is usually a comedy or some sort of a light fare. This would be one evening. You'd have a main play, which is the tragedy. Then you have another main sort of play, which is the tragedy with sort of a political message to it or theme to it. And then you have the light afterpiece. Oddly enough, the funny thing is that Gottsched and Caroline Neuber tried really, really hard to get the Hanswurst character, the clown character, out of the Haupt- und Staatsaktion, and he was too popular. Couldn't do it. So out of that group, the Royal Polish and Electoral Saxon Court Comedians, when they disband in 1739, one of the actors opens up sort of his own troupe, and that was a man by the name of Schönemann. First name is Friedrich. And so Friedrich Schönemann, around 1740, opens up his own troupe, becomes very successful, very prosperous, and he continued it until I think retired in 1757. I just got it on the list here. And the troupe he had was the Court Comedians to the Neuber-Gottsched. I think he were given that name in 1751. Yeah, there it is on your notes. If I just looked there, I would have been able to do it. So in 1753, another actor from the Court Comedians to the Neuber-Gottsched, Schönemann's troupe, splits off and creates his own troupe. Now, these guys have traveled as far as Russia, and somewhere in that neighborhood, the Ackerman sort of splits off from them and creates his own troupe of actors in 1753. He settles in a place called Königsberg, and that's where he builds the first permanent theater. And it probably is the first permanent theater in Germany to be built as a theater. In like 1550, a playwright by the name of Hans Sachs, one of the best playwrights of this era, by the way, or the Renaissance era, he converted a church into a playhouse. It was specifically used for that purpose, but it was not built as a playhouse, so they kind of said, first permanent theater built by Ackerman, even though Hans Sachs had a playhouse back in 1550. But this one in Königsberg was the first one to be used solely for the purpose of a housing and dramatic company. Then we get into the 7 Years' War. Okay, now the 7 Years' War is another war that a lot of people don't. It really, literally was sort of a world war, but it wasn't the world all attacking itself like what we would consider World War. let's call it a Western war maybe, because it even branched over into North America. If you're familiar with the French and Indian War, that was that same war, basically, over on our soil. There's several different names to the 7 Years' War, but the general 7 Years' War is the sort of overall term for all the various wars that broke out in Canada and North America and South America and Europe. In the Germanic states, it was one of the main leaders in that war was Prussia. If you're not familiar with where Prussia is, it's basically northern Germany leading over into Poland and over into Latvia a bit. If you don't know what Latvia is, then I guess it really doesn't matter that you know what Prussia is. So the 7 Years' War comes, and again, every time war happens, people tend to sort of suppress theater. It's not important, it moves on. So Ackermann was in Prussia at that time when the 7 Years' War began, and he fled. He turns up again a little bit later. He goes into, and I wouldn't say exile, but he does leave Prussia, where he was playing for all that time during the 7 Years' War. He'll turn up again later, as you'll see down on your list. All right. In 1757, the year after the 7 Years' War began, Schönemann retires. And one of his actors, by the name of Heinrich Koch, assumes control of the company. Now, he used to play each year in, a good chunk of each year in Hamburg. And that's kind of predominantly where he stayed until Ackermann shows up in Hamburg a little bit later. By 1763, Schönemann's troupe actually stops touring and they rest predominantly in Hamburg. But in 1764, Ackermann's troupe shows up in Hamburg and starts playing there. So at that point, the Schönemann troupe sort of stops in general. Ackermann builds the first permanent theater in Hamburg in 1765 to house his company, and it's only going to last about 2 years. Okay, what he's going to end up doing is he's going to lease it to the Hamburg National Theater, which you see two lines down. All right. In 1766, Koch, who was in charge of Schönemann's troupe that sort of stopped touring, was sort of well done. He went back to Leipzig and built the first permanent theater there in Leipzig. Whether he had his troupe still going at that or he was just sort of using it for other tours, I'm not certain. But I'm thinking he brought his troupe along with him. So the Hamburg National Theater is formed by a man named Johann Friedrich Lohen, who is actually Friedrich Schönemann's son-in-law. He employs a man by the name of Gotthold Ephraim Lessing. You don't need to remember that name. G.E. Lessing is what he goes by, or went by, because he's dead now. And he becomes the world's first dramaturg because they hired him to give them plays to do for a season and to work on the plays and so on and so forth. So he becomes the world's first dramaturg. And he writes all of his theories and criticism, or his critique, as you will, as well as all of the plays that he wrote, down in a book called the Hamburgische Dramaturgie. Sort of as a guidebook, really, for dramaturgs, or it was. Now, we hit 1767 to 1787 here, which is a Sturm und Drang movement. Sturm und Drang means storm and stress. This is a movement of playwrights who are basically rebelling against the rigid doctrine of neoclassicism and German rationalism. So, if there's no real structure to these plays, it's not like, well, a Sturm und Drang play is 5 acts and it has this, 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 and this. You know, it's not really that at all. There's really no structure to it. It can be anything at all, but it has some elements to it. It usually has rather explosive emotional outbursts. It has violence in it. It's usually of a subject matter and an action that will take the audience to or beyond its limits. And it was designed specifically for that. Two of the most prolific writers of this time, of this style, were Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, you probably would just heard of him as Goethe, and Friedrich Schiller. They were the two main writers of this era. So they're going to spearhead this movement until they start moving into a new concept of what they're going to do with theater, and that'll come in a little bit later with the Weimar theater. Next thing we have here is the Hamburg National Theater closes 1769. It only lasted 2 years, but it closed in 1769, and really kind of isn't heard much from again. 1773 is when the Jesuit schools were suppressed. I told you that was going to happen when we talked about them. So that's when you start seeing really seriously an end to what we would consider educational theater at this point in time, because they're now suppressed. They don't do it anymore. Actually, the Jesuits were not liked by the Catholics in a great deal of Europe. Now, in 1775, the first state theater is opened in Goethe. Not the man Goethe, the town Goethe, Gotha. And that is called the Goethe State Theater. Each member, it was pretty cool, each member is a state employee with a pension right. And the troupes are typically, this initial troupe was made up of sort of the remnants of the Hamburg National Theater actors who now had nowhere to go. And this closed around 1779, so it had about 4 years. I don't know really where the pension money went after that, probably to the military like it usually does. In 1776, Vienna did this basically the same thing. It established a state theater of its own, and that was the Imperial and National State Theater. The cool thing was that it was housed in the Burgtheater, which was a sort of a remodeled or converted tennis court, much like they did in the Renaissance era. And by 1825, it was really considered to be the best of all German language troupes. 1779, Mannheim establishes a state theater also, same year Goethe's closes. And Mannheim's theater company was predominantly made up of Goethe's troupe that lost their jobs. So they moved around a bit to where the work was. Well, we still do to this day. Now, by 1780, we see state theaters are established throughout most German-speaking areas. So they figured that this is a good idea, and it was important to have state-supported theaters, especially because Vienna was doing it. So if Vienna does it, that's what you do. And so by that time, you start seeing in all German-speaking areas, in the main cities, you see state-supported theaters. Then in 1786, a man by the name of Friedrich Wilhelm II, he reigned until 1797, from 1786 to 1797, and he established a subsidized state troupe. So now we look down here at the 1790s, and he says 70 Germanic companies. There are about 70 Germanic companies in all the German states throughout the sort of Germanic Empire, if you will, and they predominantly are permanent. They either have a permanent home of their own, or they're playing in houses that they're renting from. So nearly half of them have permanent stakes, permanently located. Touring now is really only done by minor companies. Looking at scenery, okay, until it's about 1770, you have stock pieces that they reuse again and again and again, and not terribly realistic. Until about 1767, when you use a play called Mine von Barnhelm, and that is the first attempt to use authentic sets and costumes. In actuality, to be fair, Gottsched tried to convince the Neubers of using historically accurate costumes back in the 1720s, late 1720s, early 1730s, and they just didn't follow along. Don't need to, it's not important. Now it's becoming important, some almost 40 years later. 1770s, you start to see permanent theaters that are introducing the chariot and pole scene changing, and they're starting to do a lot more of the more popular, more lavish type of scenery. By the time we hit the 1790s, you have playwrights that are beginning to write plays that have practicable door units, bridges, windows. We're getting closer and closer to the box set, which, if you're not familiar with what a box set is, almost any play you see that takes place in a room of a house or an apartment or something, you have 3 basic walls, and the 4th wall that we're looking through is supposed to be the 4th wall of the room. That's a box set. we're getting closer and closer to that because the Germans are really interested in having set pieces that actually function on stage, and that's why we're heading toward a box set. Not that we hadn't been there before; we'd already kind of started that even back in the Renaissance with Italians. Costumes, same trends as other trends in the 1770s, but in 1766, Friedrich Koch costumed one of his shows, I want to say historically accurate, right? And it took off like wildfire. That's why, of course, the next year you see Mina von Barnhelm, historically accurate. When I say historically accurate, I mean from what they know, historically they probably wore back then. There was no research done at this time. It would not be archaeological accuracy. It would be kind of our basic concept of historically accurate. And by the 1770s, historical accuracy becomes common in sets and costumes. Okay, so now we're looking at playwrights and actors. Now, who you don't have on this list, but you've already had a little earlier in this, is G.E. Lessing. He really was considered one of the finest playwrights in Germany. And obviously, like I said, it's first dramaturg as well. And he was influenced mainly by English works, more so than the French neoclassicist or even Gottsched's works. He wasn't really as influenced by them as well. He wrote predominantly tragedies, and all of his tragedies and his criticism is set down in the Hamburgische Dramaturgie. Then we have F.L. Schroeder, which is the first one you see on your list under playwrights and actors. He was actually Germany's finest actor, but he was a very good manager as well. And more importantly, he created the Hamburg school in order to train actors. So now we see the first time attempt to have actor training rather than just sort of working with people on set and slowly, almost internship-wise, learning the craft. Now we've got a school to actually teach that craft. August Wilhelm Iffland he was an actor and a playwright, and he joined the Mannheim Theater in 1779 and got became renowned mainly because of as a writer from his plays Crimes and Ambition, and it was in 1784. He really was the most important member of the Mannheim troupe. And he left it in 1796 to go lead the Berlin State Theater until about 1814. So he was a very, very important theater manager, more so even than actor and writer. Then you have Kotzebue, August Friedrich von Kotzebue. He is most well known for bringing melodrama up to a humongous status in Germany, and made it one of the more popular types. Really kind of credited with German drama by 1800 or so being some of the most popular in the world. And that's Kotzebue. Then we have Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and he was considered the greatest literary figure in theater, playwright that Germany had ever known. And he settled in Weimar in 1775, and became director of the Weimar Court Theater in 1791. It's there where he will create, with his friend Schiller, Weimar Classicism, which you'll see a little bit below there. So Friedrich Schiller, we're moving on to the last one there under your playwrights and actors, a very good friend of Goethe's and a partner of his. He also joined him in Weimar, and they too created the Weimar Classicism, basically an acting school and theater, where performances were done as well. And the interesting thing about this, why it's important, is because Goethe has kind of ceased to have any interest in the Weimar Classicism, the Weimar school, after his best friend Schiller died in 1805. So the actors that were part of this school just sort of slowly branched off, left off, and went other places. Well, they went all over Europe. So they spread Weimar Classicism, a new style of acting and production, all throughout Europe. That's why it's important. And that takes us out of the Germanic states and into the Netherlands. So looking at the Netherlands, the Academy. The Academy in 1617 is made up of all the sort of disparate societies of acting troupes that existed, and they sort of brought them all together and said, okay, now you're one troupe now, and you're called the Academy. For that, the state built them a theater in 1618 called the Schauburg, which translates to show place or show house. And in 1638, due to financial reasons, the city of Amsterdam had to assume control of it because it was in such financial distress, which is common. We've heard that in French Renaissance as well. That happened with the Paris Opera. 1644, the theater itself had sort of come into disrepair, so the city tore it down and built a new one for them, and that was called the Neuber-Gottsched, which translates to New Playhouse. Not very inventive, but there it is. 1772, that burned down, and Amsterdam built them a new one. Very generous, these Amsterdams. So they built a new one in 1774 called the Neuber-Gottsched, not the Neuber-Gottsched. That would just be silly. You really only have one dramatist worth speaking about at this point in time, and that was Just van den Wandel. He wrote basically pretty much the same stuff as Plautus and Terence, practically rip-offs of Plautus and Terence, although some of his stuff did have biblical themes to it, so there's a little bit of change here and there. And so now we move into Norway and Denmark. You've got to understand that Norway and Denmark at this particular point in time are one country. Until at least 1814, they are one country, Norway and Denmark. Courts typically maintained a French acting troupe in there, and really relied pretty much on German, French, and Italian plays. In 1720, Frederick IV dismissed his French acting troupe, kicked him out. Two actors from that troupe stayed, Montague and Capion. They petitioned the king to open a public theater, which he gave them permission. So Montague and Capion in 1722 opened their public theater. 1727, by 5 years later, it goes bankrupt. Again, another financial loss here with theater companies. Montague receives permission to use the court theater. From everything I know, Capion just left. But Montague stayed behind, and he was given permission by the king to use the court theater for his theater now. By 1730 now, however, Puritans start coming in and forcing a cease on all theatrical activity. And it wasn't until 16 years later, with a new king, Friedrich V, who lifts that ban on theater and starts it over again. In 1772, the Royal Danish Theatre is created, and that becomes their national theater troupe. The two dramatists we have here are Ludwig Holberg. Ludwig Holberg was one of the first people to use the vernacular for his plays, so their language, as opposed to prior to that Latin, French, German plays and so on. The Latin's used for scholars, French is used for theater. So medical, legal will all be Latin. Theater typically French. The other one is Johannes Ewald. And Johannes Ewald, he wrote a play called Rolf Krag, and it's the first Danish tragedy. And it's credited with laying the foundations for the Romantic movement, which will actually begin in Germany. Move on to Sweden. Sweden is really interesting because plays in the vernacular in Sweden had been used for schools since like 1550. But they didn't really affect the professional theater at all, much like the Jesuit stuff. So in 1667, we see the first permanent theater building and opened in Stockholm. 1737, excuse me. The first theater under royal patronage is founded. And it performed a mixture of French, Swedish, and Commedia dell'arte type plays. Now, the next one here is really, really interesting. And that's 1764 to 1766, the theater at Drottningholm is erected. There's a great story behind this, which actually incorporates the next line, which is the reign of Gustav III, 1771 to 1792. Gustav III was a very huge supporter of theater. As a matter of fact, he even wrote some plays, and he encouraged authors. So he really supported the arts. So the theater at Drottningholm is erected, and is a thriving house because of his support. He dies in 1792. They seal the theater up in memoriam for his death. Completely. Never used again. Until about 1921, I think it is, when somebody stumbles across it, opens it up and goes, oh my God, an 18th century theater fully intact. All the machinery, everything. It's still used today to do 18th century plays and also as a museum. So, they still use all the old machinery just like it was. They have modern electric lighting now, but in general, a lot of the stage set machinery and stuff, all still fully functional and all used. Your video there will show that. 1773, the National Theatre is formed, and that is it's a theater under royal patronage, and that is established in 1737. It's now transformed into the National Theatre. Okay, so if you look back there, it says 1737, First Theatre under royal patronage is founded. In 1773, it becomes the National Theatre. And then we move on to Russia. So, with Russia, until about 1750, primarily there were court performances with invited companies. All right, it's not until Elizabeth really kicks in her support of theater that you get anything out there publicly. There are some touring things, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But in general, most of your theater, just like everywhere else around this time, is court-centered. 1756, Empress Elizabeth, who reigned from 1741 to 1762, established a state theater for Russian plays. Now we're starting to see public theater by 1756. Until around the 1760s, they usually used French and German plays and brought those in. And the really popular ones were sentimental comedy and tragedies that were imported and brought in for those. 1767, they finally set up a pension system for acting troupes. So now their professional actors have, somewhat of a decent pay, if you can call it that, but also have a retirement for them. In 1779, an acting school is created. Okay, it's now called the St. Petersburg Theater Arts Academy. It was formerly called it was from the Cadet Court Theater, which grew out of theater classes, just general theater classes, at the Cadet Corps, which was a college for boys, and that started around 1740s. So it took a little while. It took almost 40 years for it to grow from some classes at a boys' school to an actual company to all of a sudden it is now an acting school. 1789, companies are allowed, public companies are allowed 4 benefit performances a year. Now that means that all the receipts that come in from that evening, from a benefit performance, are cut up amongst all of the actors, as opposed to them getting a small cut of it, of what was left after profit, and so on and so forth. 4 times a year, the actors share all the income that comes in. And all companies at this time are state-owned under Catherine's rule. And Catherine ruled 1762 to 1786. Catherine the Great, yeah, okay. 1790s, we have the second state theater opened in St. Petersburg. You need to keep in mind also that St. Petersburg is the capital of Russia right now, not Moscow. So this is its capital, St. Petersburg. Now, see, there were some privately, like I said, we talk about this. There were some privately owned theaters in Russia, but most of the troupes were established via serfs. If you're familiar with the concept of serfdom, I own a bunch of land, you need a place to live and food to eat, so you work my land, you get a portion of the food you work, and you get to live on my land and enjoy my protection. That's serfdom. That's like feudal era. That's like Middle Ages. It continued in the Soviet Union, not Soviet Union, but in Russia until 1861. Serfdom continued there until 1861. And what would happen is these people who had plenty of serfs to work their land but still had people left over would pull them aside and go, okay, you're going to be an acting troupe now. For your serfdom, for living on my land and enjoying my protection, you're going to act for me as my own private acting troupe. It's sort of a prestigious thing. And that's how a lot of private touring companies were formed. Kind of like slavery, yeah. So, looking now at the 2 dramatists we have, Alexander Sumrkov. Alexander Sumrkov wrote plays on Russian subjects sort of in the French neoclassical style. And his tragedies and satirical comedies are really the beginning of the Russian classical school of dramatic writing. And then you have Fyodor Folkov, and he began writing plays around 1750. He was brought before the Empress Elizabeth in 1752, and some of the actors from his company were actually taken away and not taken away and shot, but taken away and sent to the Academy of the Nobility for training. She was that impressed with his work that she decided to take some of his actors and send them to specialized training for acting. And he is really considered to be the father of Russian professional theater, Fyodor Volkov. And that ends our section on Northern and Eastern Europe.